left us, and hopefully will come back. Um, I don't know if you guys had a chance to see the agenda. It's not very busy. We're going to give Paul a chance to talk, and he's going to talk about his overwintering loon stuff. And we should try to con Jay into doing a summary about his stuff when he gets back.
Absolutely.
We'll just tell him that he's on the meeting, the next meeting, and say, "You're up, Jay. Go for it." And we'll just see what happens here. I guess we could start with a few updates. There's not much to update. I can share with about the loon aggression that we discussed last week in Quebec. And Laura's here if she wants to chime in. They sent us the reports and stuff, and they definitely have a problem. They have had a loon who has been highly aggressive for about 7 years and has attacked several feet.
Wow.
Including one of a child. So we're going to just leave that in the hands of the governing bodies, and we're going to just give advice, right? I don't know what else we can do. Like, I've never seen a situation like that before.
And no, I haven't either. Has anybody reported anything like that? I don't know if certainly there have been loons that have been very defensive towards other loons, towards other birds, towards things that were threats to their territories or chicks, but I've never heard of something like this.
The common consensus last week was that everybody's kind of waiting to see it happen, but it hadn't happened yet.
Yeah.
Does it have a mate?
Yeah, they're actively nesting, and it's a small lake, and the way I read it is it could be almost anywhere on the lake that they get aggressive about. So I'm assuming it's close to where the chick is or the nest is or something, but they actually they're a great group. They're trying to keep an eye on it. They're trying to do the right thing, but this loon is totally not cooperating with them.
Well, it's migrated now, right?
Yes, yes. And for sure, I would assume that lake wasn't that far north, Laura, was it? It'd be another few weeks before it freezes up. I can't hear you.
Still, no.
We're not having the best of day when it comes to technology when it looks at it.
Maybe Laura needs to get off and get back on.
Always worth a try. Oh, there's Paul again.
Oh, is Paul back? Good. I was just about to email him. And he's connecting the audio.
Fingers crossed.
Hi, Paul. Can you hear us?
How about it now?
Perfect.
Hey.
Welcome back. It's just one of those.
Yeah, they made me install some new stuff.
That's what computers do. Well, welcome everyone. We'll get started. Everybody, I don't know how many of us know Paul. Some of us have heard him present at Nelswake, haven't we, Mark?
Yeah, Paul has certainly done that in the past.
And so Paul has for many years done some non-breeding loon ecology and mortality work. And I've sent you his talking notes. And when he's ready, I'll put his slides up. And I've also put a couple other documents in the notes and in the folder that are Paul's. And just so that I don't forget, and I'm sure Paul will mention this as well, he's looking for people who want to volunteer to monitor loons down in Florida. You're not down there anymore, Paul?
Oh, no, I'm at home on the eastern shore of Chesapeake Bay. I never lived down there, but I had good connections down there, close to where I did the migration study. I also have a brother who's a prof at Tulane, so I had New Orleans and I had that part of the Gulf. And I worked in that part of the Gulf as a contractor after the Deepwater Horizon. So I pretty much know a lot of the Gulf habitats. I don't really know down the peninsula. Walter Piper has very great concern about what's going on in Tampa Bay because he's getting a lot of band recoveries from there. And it appears that his juvenile survivorship is not what it formerly was. He's got data that speaks to that. And I'm kind of hoping that Walter will have some colleague who will really spend some serious time in the winter season with the loons on Tampa Bay, and also work with probably with the state of Florida, because the state of Florida does a tremendous job with red tides, and red tides algal toxins may very well be part of the loon issues as you go down the Florida peninsula. So that all needs to be done, and I obviously would encourage people to do it. In particular, Walter's out in California. If he has a winter colleague who can be down on Tampa Bay, somebody who needs a learning curve that way, because it's about both loons and marine biology. You cannot separate the two. You have to study the ecosystem while you're studying the loons.
I don't think we have a lot of good contacts here for Florida, but everybody's got it now in their heads and we can all think about it.
Yeah.
Well, I don't know. I see Griffin is on this email and or on this Zoom, and he's based up there in the Adirondacks, and there's not much loon action up there during the winter season. And anyone who's interested scientifically in the breeding biology of loons should take at least a passing interest in the non-breeding biology, because it's a whole other aspect of the birds. And Kathy, we have a lot of friendly natives of your nation to the south who would be interested in this sort of thing.
I think it's just the case that everybody only has so much time. You are absolutely right, though. It's important and it's known to be a important component, which is why you're here today.
Sure.
Now, do you want me to start your slides, or are you
Yeah, that'd be great.
And you'll just have to tell me. I'm not used to running slides off of Microsoft off the what's this OneDrive, so we'll see how well this goes.
Okay. You did a great job of putting them up online if anybody wants to refer to them. All my material that I sent you is online, including an essay describing the Florida migration study. You did a great job with that, and I thank you.
All right. Do people see a not very happy loon right now?
It
Not
says
up right
Kathy
now.
Jones.
There we go. Now we're in business. And I guess I just asked you to forward them, huh? When we go slide by slide, Kathy, I just cue you.
I think that's the best way. And what time is it here? 4:11. I'll let you know if we're getting close to being too long, but you have plenty of time to talk.
Okay.
Yeah.
I promise I won't talk as long as our president-elect does. Okay, so non-breeding mortality, you have to consider it in the context of life history events, which means, among other things, adult wing molt. And the argument is that adult wing molt makes common loons a sensitive species in the marine environment. And they go flightless. The data I have say they go flightless for between 5 and 6 weeks. And that gets really interesting because initially, that may be helpful in terms of deep diving over the shelves. It's known from a variety of people's work, especially Kevin Keno's fabulous work, that loons are wintering out over both continental shelves, Atlantic and Gulf. And his pressure sensor data tells us that they're diving deep. They're going down to just above the bottom to near benthic feeding. And that probably is more efficient when you've lost your flight feathers, when you've lost your remiges, such as this bird you see here. And then over time, over that month and a half that they regrow, you become adept at benthic feeding, and you've also each year scoped out what's down there and where the best feeding is. So that probably is absolutely fundamental life history event. And it's important to note that the juveniles and the second year birds are not on the winter wing molt cycle. and they may be very well burdened by those remiges as far as getting deep, and also they've never dived deep before. Perhaps they might have done it a little bit, say on the Great Lakes coming down, because Kevin has tremendous data on how stopover loons on the Great Lakes also dive deep. But I think you can argue that we have two separate ecological forms of the loon here. I don't think so. It's absolutely so. You have adults that go flightless, and then you have juvies and subadults that remain flighted over the course of the winter. And sometimes comparisons with red-throated loons are helpful, because red throats also do not go flightless in the winter. And in the big mortality event that I studied back in '93 in the late winter and spring in North Carolina, there was no red-throated loon mortality whatsoever. And in general, red throats have very light winter mortality. You don't find them when you're out doing these beach surveys. So this is all absolutely fundamental stuff. And you can see, among other things, of course, flightlessness means a bird can't avoid oil, even if it knew what oil was in the first place. Okay.
Next.
Next. In addition to internal diagnostics, there's also always that initial examination. If you look at the feet of this bird, you can see that this is a bird that got trapped in a fisherman's net and struggled in vain to escape. You can see the damage on the joint just above the feet. This is a bird from Baja, by the way. I've studied non-breeding loons at a whole range of sites, Pacific as well as Gulf and Atlantic, and I've also done some non-breeding work in the summer up around the Gulf of St. Lawrence. So there's a lot of fascinating. It's a great entree to marine biology anywhere you go. And you walk into a lab as somebody who's a vertebrate life history person, and you make friends with all of the marine biologists and fisheries biologists who want to know why on earth you're there. And this was particularly productive in North Carolina at the NOAA NIMS lab in Beaufort. There are other labs there. The Duke lab is on the same island. So anyone who commits to working on non-breeding loon biology is going to have a wonderful voyage into marine biology. I did it sort of as a postdoc. I was based there in Beaufort for 6 years, from '91 through '96. And it was my good luck, the loon's bad luck, that the mortality event occurred right in the middle of that in '93. Once I vaguely knew what I was doing and had my colleagues in place. Okay, next slide. Kathy, you can go to the next one, please.
Yep, I'm working on it. There you go.
There we go. So this is a summary of what I just said. 6 years, flightless for about 6 weeks, reduced to swimming mobility, which leaves the birds vulnerable to a food failure or to intense storms, both of which occurred in '93. But initially better for deep diving. I can't prove that, but I certainly think that fits. What we know about fish diving specialists over the course of time, some of them have gone flightless, such as the Galapagos cormorant and the late great auk. So you might say that, again, this is a profound life history event for the common loon and not necessarily recognized as such. Okay. Thank you. So here we are in '93, and this is something anyone who goes looking, if you have a mortality event or if you're just out in the winter surveying, and you find loons in sheltered habitats, which are not really good feeding habitats, just sort of there and sleeping. You see a couple of those birds have their heads tucked into their wings. These are birds that probably are not going to survive. They're emaciated, and loons famously are diehards. One gains a great admiration for the sheer spirit of this species and for its intelligence, of course, because it's a highly specialized body, which is a triumph of evolution in some ways, but leaves the animal vulnerable in other ways. And the implication is that in order to be as successful as common loons are, they have to have a large dose of, quote, loon intelligence, which is not an oxymoron. These are very intelligent animals at a non-human level, a level that we struggle to comprehend, and that's part of the fun of working on them, both breeding and non-breeding. Okay. So again, just a shot of what this was what I found that spring. Birds essentially running out of gas, and this is beach survey work. The Park Service gave me an ATM, and I did a lot of these. North Carolina beaches are absolutely gorgeous, and I would run them and get birds that were moribund and sometimes already dead. And you can see there the blood quills on that bird. It simply couldn't achieve completion of the molt. There are always going to be some birds like that in March and April, and that's worth. Beach surveys are wonderful things to do if somebody gives you an ATM or even just walking. But obviously, with a vehicle, you can cover a lot more ground. It's a beautiful season to be on any of those coasts. There's a lot of shorebird migration, such as red knots, marbled godwits. Back in the marshes, there are whimbrels. Okay. So I collected a slew of those birds, by the way, and worked with, called in Fish and Wildlife and USGS, and they did necropsies, and they took organs for contaminants such as mercury and selenium, and there were no toxics issues. And the question of the food regime, when you get, Occam's razor says that you look for the simplest answer to a question, to a problem, and it was emaciation, mortality. And in the fullness of time, it became clear as the menhaden data was collected, because menhaden are commercially a very important species. And in the fullness of time, it became clear that there'd been a huge decline in juvenile menhaden, which is what loons are adapted to catch. Okay, we published this, all you note, in good journals. So here you have some young of the year menhaden. These are smaller a little bit than what loons would take. The juveniles, as they migrate south, are probably about 6 inches long. They're already intensely social fish, and the loons adapt to this. As you all know, loons are very aggressive and territorial up on the breeding grounds, but that collapses during stopovers in the wintering grounds. We can go as far back as Judy McIntyre with her flock feeding studies on Mille Lac Lake up in Minnesota. And I had a huge, that's how I got started in the late 80s and early 90s, because at that time, competitor striped bass were vastly reduced. Menhaden were very high, and it may have been for climate reasons, something called the multi-decadal Atlantic oscillation, which again gives, as I said, you have to be interdisciplinary if you're going to do this work. And it's a wonderful voyage into marine biology. It's been a great experience. Okay. So here we see, there's your adult menhaden, planktivorous fish, highly social flock schooling fish. And down below that would be about the size, the peanuts or young of the year, that are prime prey for menhaden and for flock feeding menhaden during the stopovers, such as the Chesapeake. And other clupeid herring-like fish are appropriate. Up in the TVA, there's all kinds of gizzard shad and such, and loons migrating through on both seasons, and also to some extent overwintering. I've seen a lot of loon flock feeding on some of those TVA lakes, and Kevin Keno's data speaks to that, to the extent to which they use those lakes and stay on them for a while. And I would like to see Keno's work put into a user accessible document, not too dry. He did such a beautiful body of work back in the last decade, and it's absolutely one of the keys to our understanding of loon biology outside the breeding season. It's really award-winning stuff. Okay. And here's what subsequently became available with regard to juvenile menhaden, which are there's a gold standard Chesapeake data on this through the Maryland DNR. And you can see that there was a period of about 16 years when there were very large numbers of juvenile menhaden out there. This coincides with the time when striped bass were in really bad shape, so competition was drastically reduced. It also fits with what we know about this Atlantic multi-decadal oscillation, that there were climate things going on, currents, etc. because menhaden spawn out on the adjacent coastal sea, and the larvae have to make their way in. So there are parameters associated with that. So it looks like probably menhaden were getting two benefits here, the climate and the reduced competition. And then you see all of a sudden down they go. And that's the point. Let's go ahead now. Next slide. That's the point at which I had my big die-off. Fortunately, during this same period, I was working closely with Patuxent, and they had aerial surveys of winter sea ducks, and I persuaded them to include loons in those surveys, and I flew some of the surveys too. So these are transects that reflect, that are good ones in terms of understanding this. On the big ocean bays of the Carolinas, Onslow Bay and Long Bay, you see before the die-off and before the crash of menhaden, abundance of loons, and then look what happens afterwards. Down she goes. It would be very interesting to know currently what the quantities of loons wintering along the Carolina ocean coasts are. That would be great data to have. Maybe somebody can be persuaded to do some survey flights. Okay. So my last topic here also relates to mortality and how loons are intelligent enough to avoid mortality, because the issue of the cross-continent migrations, there's a lot of danger involved there. And I'm forgetting her name, but there's a woman up in Wisconsin who has documented downing of loons on spring migration due to hailstorms and snowstorms and things. They can get into a lot of trouble, and they're sensitive to too much precipitation. They also have to have their watery landing strips. So I got involved in this because I was on the Deepwater Horizon assessments, and I have a colleague, Andy Cratter, very helpful guy who studies loon migration across the Florida Peninsula. He's in Gainesville at the State Museum, a great guy, very perceptive biologist. And yeah, and the Grenzers should be involved. I see you have the note there. Definitely the Grenzers should have a handle in this. Anyway, he predicted that there would be a flyway up Appalachia Bay. And since I was there with a little money in my pocket and friends over that way, I went to look, and sure enough, there it was. And I studied over 5 separate seasons, about 3 weeks each time. And I totally encourage people to do this. I will tell you, you have to get up about 5 o'clock in the morning for 3 weeks in a row and get down to the St. Mark's Refuge before dawn to take the data. But the whole show is over each day. Often it's only an hour's worth of flight. Sometimes a big day might extend into 2 hours. And the take-home message is that they're very, very careful about when they leave. They won't fly on an overcast, bad visibility, or when rain threatens. And then there's this question of aborted missions. Fascinating that in the first half of that 3-week period, potentially quite a lot of them come back fairly soon. And there's been social mediation to depart, but some of those birds, for whatever reason, the physiology of their wing mold, or perhaps they still have undigested food in their guts, because obviously the day they go, they're going pre-dawn and dawn, and they're not feeding at that point. For whatever reason, in the first half of that 3-week period, you get a significant number of aborted missions. And in one situation where I had a lot going out, almost 500, I had almost half of them coming back because there was a big storm front out over up at the Florida line and beyond, where they couldn't assess that when they left Appalachia Bay. So you put all this together. This is natural selection on the line. This is where loons live or die when they make this cross-continental flight after their long flightless period. And the implication is aerial intelligence. Okay. So this is what you want to see. This is a non-breeding plumage bird, but of course, it's very gratifying to see airborne loons and to see them migrating. And just look at that massive body and those rather slender wings. They don't have a wing loading remotely like a goose or a swan. It's particularly, Canada goose is about the same weight. They have to beat those wings 3 times a second. There's no gliding, so it's a marathon for them, and thus they choose optimal conditions, or they avoid marginal conditions is a better way of putting it. And there are all kinds of stopovers, many of which they probably know about because some of these birds are up into their 20s. Some birds fly as singletons, but there's some small groups that go out as well. And I love the fact that they take those feet that are so far back on their bodies, rotate them 90 degrees and press them together and use them as a flight control surface, essentially a rudder. Okay. And this is a little glimpse at this wonderful work that Kevin Kino did. You can see how many of those birds are wintering offshore. There's a big cluster over a marine sanctuary called the Florida Middle Grounds, and that's almost due south of where I was doing my study. So I probably was subsequently seeing some of those birds when they flew north. But Kino, you want to read Kino's papers. They're fundamental to what's going on. And you want to read my book once I get it out. Thank you. Next slide. So that's the Big Bend of Florida, as they call it. And you can see that Appalachia Bay is a divot that extends north. And all things being equal, loons want to stay over water as long as they can when they make this venture across the continent. So the St. Mark's Refuge is right at the top of that divot. And then Tallahassee, people see them overflying in Tallahassee. I haven't tried to quantify that, but they do see them. They're still pretty, they haven't gained all that much elevation. They go over Tallahassee low enough that if you're in the right spot, you can see them. Okay. So there's where history is made. This is a wonderful observation tower at the refuge. It looks out over Appalachia Bay on one side and the St. Mark's River on the other side. A good place to take data. I wouldn't mind cutting down those 2 palm trees, although they're really not in the way because you can look both east and west and get your transects. Okay. Next slide. And this is the glory of what you see every morning when the weather's good. You get to greet the dawn down there at Appalachia Bay, and it's a wonderful, spiritually, this is a lovely thing to do. And loons are already flying by this time. Some of them fly before dawn, and a few of those birds coming over, you only hear, you can't count them, but you hear the tremolos because they are using contact calls before the light is this strong. Okay. And that's what you see when you look east. When you look west, you have fully illuminated birds. When you look east, you get them in profile. Okay. And this is when they don't fly. When you have inclement weather, you might as well stay home and just catch up on your sleep. Okay. There are all kinds of migratory events. This tremendous marathon that's involved for loons, three wing beats per second and no remission from that. Compare that, it's really great to be greeting the spring on that Florida coast. You see all manner of arrivals and departures. This is late in the morning, the thermals are up, and this is a big flock of white pelicans that are going to soar their way north. And that's the last of my slides. And so I could take some questions at this point. Hi, Sherry, it's nice to see you there. Hello, Griffin.
Hey, Paul. Great presentation.
Thank you.
Yes, Paul, I remember I was in Lake Jocassee with you. You were on the boat with us doing a little bit of work for a couple of days there. Yeah.
You were all very welcoming and kind to me. I had a great time.
Oh, that's great. Yeah, I would love to have that picture, that one picture you have of the very heavy body and the really thin wings and the feet closed. I think that really is a good one for some of us to use in presentations to get the point across about that surface area and just really what a hard time they have.
What a challenge it is. Yeah, a picture is worth 1,000 words, and I will send that to you, Sherry.
Okay, that'd be great.
Paul, what was the name of the fish that they eat?
Well, you see, if you lived here on Chesapeake Bay, you'd know all about it. It's a migratory herring called the menhaden. It occurs in huge quantities along the Atlantic coast, and it's harvested in very large numbers. There's also a very similar species on the Gulf Coast, also harvested in large numbers. So
So
there's a lot
do
of
you-
good science. The menhaden, there's a lot of good science that's been done on it, but it's also highly political because these harvests are worth a lot of money. The fish get rendered down into meal and oil. The company that owns the Chesapeake operation, it's been sold to a Canadian company, probably partly because it's politically so fraught. And that Canadian I'm trying to think of their name, Cook Fisheries, I think it is. They do a lot of pen-reared salmon on both coasts of Canada. And by buying the menhaden operation, they've eliminated middlemen. They basically can now just take that menhaden meal and convert it into salmon.
So did you say there was a great, highs and lows in the numbers of menhaden?
Yes, that's absolutely fundamental. I basically think that there are two reasons that 1993 mortality occurred. And by the way, mass mortality events of loons appear to be very rare, which is another way of saying that despite their specialization, they're very well adapted birds. But they do have this Achilles heel of flightlessness. And yeah, the data came in later that that there was a huge crash of juvenile and adult menhaden at that point. At that time, there was a menhaden harvester, a couple boats that went out of Beaufort, North Carolina, and they didn't go out that spring. The rarity, the dearth of fish was so great that the menhaden fishery just shut down that spring. So I have multiple lines of evidence that this emaciation mortality was caused by lack of
So
food.
do you know what the reasons are for the discrepancy in the numbers of menhaden? What
I
causes?
think it's twofold. I think there was a comeback of striped bass in the early '90s after the fish had really been low, had been mismanaged. When they mismanaged bass are slow to mature and they don't always have a good young of the year, a good reproductive year. And really dumb things were being done back in the '70s and '80s, and they simply overharvested. Then it took a while to recoup from that mistake. And then the data, there's a good paper by some fine marine biologists that all of a sudden this multi-decadal Atlantic oscillation shifted to a pattern that was unfavorable to the survival of these juvenile menhaden. The spawn had more trouble getting into the system. I forget all the details, but basically these menhaden suffered a 1-2 punch in the late '70s and early '80s, or rather, they had two very favorable factors in the late '70s and early '80s, and then rather quickly that changed, and the juvenile population crashed, and the long-lived loons had gotten used to that. We know from Jim Peruch's work that they have a very strong tendency to return to the same wintering sites every year because they know the territory. If you're going flightless, you want to be able to dive down and make sure that your benthic prey are there. Oh yes, and menhaden in the winter, they migrate to those sites and they go deep. They don't stay up at the top of the water column. Apparently, they go deep. The mud
Oh,
royals, and apparently, what the schools of fish do is go down and they stir the benthos and then they filter feed on the benthos. So my point, Gail, of course, if you want to study winter biology of common loons, you've got to look at prey base and the factors that affect it.
And I have one more question. I found it fascinating that red-throated loons do not molt. And I would think that over, what is it, millions of years that there have been loons? Or thousands of years, why haven't they evolved to not need to molt?
Well, no,
The other loons are collectively more closely related, and the thought is that red-throated loons may represent a primitive pattern fact, they do molt their flight. They do go flightless. You think of the wear and tear on loon flight feathers between being out on water, be it fresh or salt. The flight challenges of propelling that heavy body through the air on long migrations. The red throats do it in the autumn before they reach their wintering grounds. They do it in places like the Great Lakes and the Gulf of Lawrence. I had a biologist in Nova Scotia tell me that on the waters, the salt waters up there, red-throated loons do a quote swimming migration, and what he was talking about was that they are flightless before they get to us. Of course, they're coming from farther north. You know, they're not using the. There's essentially no breeding habitat overlap as far as I know. The red-throated throats are up on tundra. They're up in the Arctic, and the common loons are boreal breeders. We're at the southern edge of their range, but of course, yellow-billed loons do get up to very high latitude, and we just have some of them that come across from Kamchatka and such. You know, they're big. Yakutia. I meant Yakutia, not Kamchatka. They're big breeding ranges all across Eurasia. I think they go as far west as High Norway, even. I'm pretty sure. We get a little glimpse of them, and they are, even though they're closely related to common loons, their life is adapted to being farther north. It's fascinating. Judy McIntyre started to get at this. She has a very nice write-up of this in her book, which is a wonderful book. I can't say enough good things about Judy. She got us all started on loons. When you read that book, you realize what an extraordinary life history it is. And you also realize how much more there was to be learned. And a number of us, subsequent to that book, I think it was published in '81, have filled that understanding, but there's much more work to be done because these are dynamic ecosystems, and what is a challenge for loons in one particular year may not be in another year. The whole question, Walter's got this fascinating situation with Tampa Bay and the potential for neurotoxicology, and I hope Walter will find a colleague who can come from some chilly northern place and settle into Tampa Bay for the winter. The same is, by the way, the same is true of this 3 weeks of spring study down on the Gulf Coast, down at Appalachia Bay. That's the period that's known as mud season up in New England, and it's a trying time of year, you know. And I dare say that Minnesota and Wisconsin also have a mud season, and I believe the Grensers figured out that quite a while ago.
I just wanted to pop in for a minute and let you guys know that one of the powers of eBirds, and talking to northern scientists, we do have loons attempting to nest in the north above the tree line. I'm not so sure how successful they are. So they can be found up there, but they're in very small numbers compared to the other species. Oh, Tamara might know. Yeah.
Sorry, this is my first meeting that I was successful to join. I'm Tamara Zeller. I'm a biologist with the Fish and Wildlife Service in Alaska. And so I've studied loons up here for 25 years, and we're really lucky. We have all 5 species. We have a small smattering of Arctic loons, and then but there is an area in Alaska where common loons are nesting above the Arctic Circle. It's in western Alaska. It's just above the Arctic Circle where we can get all 5 species. So, you know, there's a spectrum of activity, but so this is really fascinating. Really interesting to hear we don't have a lot of information on our wintering loons, so or off non-breeding.
Yeah, well, yeah, Tamara, a couple of things. First of all, when you talk about the West Coast, wide open, no work has been. A lot of the Pacific loons winter off of Baja, both on the ocean side and in the Gulf of California. And nobody even knows there's got to be a flight crossover. I think it's around San Felipe, but the winter biology of the Pacific loon is wide open for study, and presumably you would find a Mexican colleague to do it with. And time was when these kinds of internet questions, when funding was available for them. I don't know if it still is or not, but it would make sense once again to pair with a local reader who knows the marine environment. The other thing that I got out of the Alaska stuff, because I've been a student, I've very closely read anything that Judy McIntyre and Jack Barr wrote, and they were the dominant workers at that point and got to go up and do postmortems back in '89 with the huge oil spill there. And the latitude of that was relatively high, being Alaska. The fascinating thing was that virtually all of the carcasses that they checked, about 150 of adults, were in wing molt at a time when birds that winter more temperately lighted again and would be breeding again. So not surprisingly, loon wing molt, at least within limits, and you might have to talk site specific, but it's true on the South Atlantic side too, comparing North Carolina and the Gulf of Mexico. Common loon wing molt is very powerful on a latitudinal gradient. And if you think about photoperiod and you think about the challenges of cold weather, it makes sense that it should be deferred in Alaska. And the whole thing gets very interesting as to how common loons manage to fit their rather long breeding cycle into the high latitude of Alaska. I'd like to read a paper about that. Thanks for checking in. I really appreciate it.
Sure. Yeah. Yellowbills are even more compressed because they're up in the North Slope.
Yes, I've seen yellowbills on. Years ago, I had an assignment, on the North Slope of the Brooks Range down there on the Colville River. So I've had the pleasure of watching yellowbills.
So we have a little over 10 minutes left. Any other questions, folks? Okay,
I have-
Sheila has them.
Yeah, I have a question. So I live in north central Minnesota on the Gull Chain of Lakes. And Sharon's on this call. And this summer we observed a red throat on our north central Minnesota lake. And we thought maybe it took off. But then when I was out looking for juveniles this fall, I found it molted on the same lake and it's got to be the same one.
Sure.
So we're wondering, given what you were just saying too about that swimming migration, do you think this red throat is going to get out of here or did get out of here?
I think it was probably a bird that was somehow disabled, but was still competent enough to be able to feed itself until you finally, I guess, found it dead when it was molted.
No, it was alive and very, very active. When we found it in the fall, it was really, really spirited. It was doing a lot of fishing.
It was on the proper, let me interrupt and say it was on the proper time frame as far as molting. It was when fall is when other red-throated loons go flightless, and somehow it simply had gotten disoriented and dislocated from its normal flight path. Because they cut across, they use the Great Lakes and they use the maritime waters of Canada, and then we see them in quantity from, let's say, I suppose, southern New England on down to North Carolina. They drop out. They don't go much south of that. And then on the West Coast, they would have the Pacific Coast has cold water, which may enable them to go somewhat farther south. The only place I know of where you could do a good winter study of red throats in the U.S. would be Tomales Bay by Point Reyes in California. And it's possible you could get Park Service money for that. Also, lots of red throats winter in the sounds of Alaska. They're a bird that likes to be in a sound. They're not so much a full ocean bird. And then there were very interesting questions. they appear to thrive on wind, while common loons avoid wind. But of course, this ties in with all the papers now that have been written about wind turbine development in Northern Europe. You know, the Skagerrak and the Kattegat are big red thrones wintering areas, and apparently the data is coming in that those flocks, because they are aerial flock feeders, which is fascinating too, that those flocks tend to avoid turbine installations.
So this guy then, if he was flightless, is probably just gonna die because
Well, no, if he was healthy and sufficiently healthy to regrow his remiges, his primaries and secondaries, he might make it.
how long would that take if we saw him?
I don't know how long it takes in red throats. They're smaller birds than commons. It might be that it's a shorter flightless period. I don't think anybody really has any rigorous documentation of the flightless period in the red throat. And that also gets very interesting. Sherry knows this because Sherry's been involved at Lake Jocassee in North Carolina. There's some things possible there that are much more difficult in a marine environment. This is a gorgeous freshwater lake where a number of people have been doing winter biology and teach-ins with many people coming of common loons. That's a good place to get an estimate of what the duration of common loon flightlessness is, because they've got color tagged birds there, and they just simple behavior. You know, there's a very long probably over 6 weeks. Well, loons basically, adult loons just don't fly because they're in this restoration process. And the same would be true. You basically had a little glimpse of an inaccessible life history of the red-throated loon life history. And it would be interesting to know, even now, if that, well, of course, the bird couldn't survive the winter because of ice, but it's an interesting story that you've got there.
Yeah, it's, everybody had to take their boats out at a certain point, so we haven't been able to monitor it. I mean, the lake's still open, and it was on the big.
Let me just jump in because this is something that Mark is very involved with, and we'll be talking about at the Atlantic Marine Bird Group in December. And that is that the real accessibility to common loon mortality is these beach surveys and inlet surveys at the end of winter, which is when most of it happens, March and April. So so that is workable, and it's, as I said, a lovely time of year to be down there. It's mud season up north.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Any other questions, folks?
Thanks for your kind attention. It's really been fun to do this. And anyone who wants more information about logistics of the Carolinas or of the Florida Gulf, I'm an open book. Don't hesitate to contact me. Kathy has my email, which is Spitzer_Paul@hotmail.com. And I'm working on my book. So these kinds of probing questions and requests help me, inspire me to keep working on my book manuscript. And I hope Griffin gets out of the Adirondacks and gets down to Florida at some point.
Talk to Nina about that one.
Terrific. I will add your email to the notes, and then everybody will have access to the notes as well as the links you sent. We probably don't have a lot of time left, so we'll just cover a couple housekeeping. Mark, do you still need photos for your digital project, or is that moving forward good enough?
Yeah, just a quick update on that. It is moving forward. And for anybody who wants more information, or if you didn't get the notices on that, feel free to email me, and I'll let you know. But we do have an AI, digital specialist, Phil Iwano, who is collecting the loon photographs and trying to train an AI to tell individual loons apart by plumage patterns. And we can use still photos, and we can also use videos from things like nest cams, and so even birds that are in rehab. And we're focusing on breeding loons at this point in breeding plumage. And, I can, if you want, I can post Phil's email online, but we have a Google folder set up where people can download their photos. And we should have some initial results, I think, coming out probably in early spring, hopefully in time for Nelswig. We'll have something that we can say indicating this. But, given how ubiquitous AI and digital image recognition is becoming for a whole variety of different vertebrates, it's not much used on birds yet because of the complex nature of feathers and how they tend to move across one another when the loon changes the position of its neck or something. But Phil's got some really interesting algorithms, which I understand nothing about, that hopefully will yield some success on this. So we'll see where it goes. But yeah, we've got a number of photographers and videographers who've contributed at this point. The Paul Shooks in Washington State, a bunch of people here in New England, not too many people in the Midwest yet, but we're working on that.
On it.
Terrific.
Yeah.
So the steering committee for this group is going to meet next week or the week after. So just no, next week, yeah, or the week after.
Second, yeah.
Yeah, I made an arbitrary decision because I figured we do the same thing every year. No December meeting. So if people would like to meet over the Christmas holidays, speak up. I personally would prefer not to, but it's up to you guys. We have to have a conversation, and probably half of you guys will be traveling. So I'm thinking it's best just not to meet that for December.
Kathy, who's on the steering committee?
Right now, we're down to 3 people. So that's one of the conversations we will have because we don't have a mandate on how many people should be on the steering committee. So right now, it's myself, no, 4 people, myself, Mark, Natasha, and Jay. I forget, I emailed the other 3 and not myself, so I forget that I'm on it. But we will, we've had a couple names put forward. If people want to put the names forward, they can go ahead. I don't think we want to get it too unwieldy. It's difficult enough to get 4 or 5 people to find time in their life to do a meeting. But certainly we should have a couple more people on there and kind of refresh a few things. Topics for January. I'd love to have ideas. Subcommittees might be a good one to update if people have things to update then. And same with February and March. We don't have anything planned. And that's where we stand. If anybody has any comments or anything like that. Okay, well, Paul, thank you very much for talking to us. This is all recorded, so that it will go on YouTube and it'll be just shared with the group. If I'll make sure you get CC'd the recording as well. And we really appreciate you taking the time and come and talk to us today.
I was very grateful to do it, Kathy, and everybody should also, you've done a wonderful job of putting the outline of this talk online and also the slides, so that's accessible.
Yep, they'll get all that information. And I've also been dropping in links all evening about Menhaden and what else we've been talking about. So I'll add those links to the notes as well. So everybody will have those links as well. So I guess that's it, folks. We're ending on time, which is rare for us. And have a great time at the next meeting, guys.
Have a great Thanksgiving, everybody.
Bye.
Happy Thanksgiving.
Thanks, everybody.
Bye.
Happy Thanksgiving.